Morning arrived slowly outside the city of Mykolaiv. The light came through a thin layer of gray clouds, revealing fields, narrow roads, and small houses that had stood quietly in that region for decades. The villages outside the city had always been places where daily routines moved at a familiar pace. People woke early. Farm equipment started before the sun rose fully above the horizon. Neighbors knew each other by name. But when the Russian invasion began pressing toward southern Ukraine, those same villages suddenly found themselves standing directly in the path of advancing forces. The geography of the region made that reality unavoidable. Mykolaiv sits in a strategic position between the Black Sea coast and the routes leading deeper into Ukraine. The roads that pass through the villages surrounding the city became important corridors during the early days of the conflict. And as Russian forces attempted to push forward, Ukrainian defenders began organizing positions around those villages. What followed was something that could not be easily predicted from maps or military planning. Residents of the villages did not simply leave the area behind. Many stayed. They watched the roads that led toward their homes. They helped prepare defensive positions alongside Ukrainian soldiers who had moved into the area. The cooperation between civilians and the Ukrainian military became visible almost immediately. Soldiers arrived carrying equipment and instructions. Villagers arrived carrying tools, supplies, and local knowledge of the land. Together, they began shaping the landscape into a defensive line. Roads that had once carried tractors and delivery trucks became observation points. Ditches and tree lines were studied carefully. Every path leading toward the villages was considered. The soldiers understood the tactical situation. The villagers understood the terrain. And when those two kinds of knowledge met, something important began to form: coordination, a shared determination. The villages outside Mykolaiv were not large places. Some consisted of only a few streets and scattered houses surrounded by farmland, but each of those homes represented something deeply personal to the people who lived there. Family photographs, gardens planted year after year, rooms where children had grown up. Leaving those places behind was not a simple decision. So many residents chose another path. They stayed near their homes and worked alongside the Ukrainian defenders who were preparing to hold the area. One resident described the moment in quiet words that reflected the feeling shared by many. "These roads lead to our houses." It was not a dramatic declaration, just a simple fact. But facts like that carried enormous meaning during those days. Ukrainian soldiers began coordinating with the villagers to strengthen positions along the roads outside Mykolaiv. Some people helped move materials that could slow vehicles. Others helped identify routes that might be used to approach the villages. The work happened steadily, without ceremony, without public attention, just neighbors and defenders moving together through fields and along village streets. From a distance, the scene might have looked ordinary: people walking between houses, vehicles moving carefully along the roads. But the purpose behind those movements had changed completely. Every action now connected to the defense of the area, and the soldiers stationed there understood something important about the people around them. These villagers were not observers. They were participants in protecting their homes. The rhythm of life in the villages adjusted quickly. Where conversations once centered on harvests or weather, discussions now included road access and visibility across open land. Farm paths that had been used for years suddenly held strategic importance. Fields that once produced crops now offered wide views of approaching vehicles. The land itself became part of the defensive plan. For the Ukrainian soldiers who had arrived to protect Mykolaiv, the presence of the villagers created a different atmosphere than many other military positions. They were not standing alone in unfamiliar territory. They were surrounded by people who understood every curve of the road and every line of trees. That knowledge mattered. It meant that the defenders could move with greater awareness. They could anticipate where visibility was strongest. They could understand how the landscape shifted between villages. One Ukrainian soldier later described that cooperation in a short reflection: "When people protect their homes together, the ground feels different." Those words captured the feeling that had begun to spread through the villages outside Mykolaiv. This was no longer simply a military position. It was a shared defense. Villagers and soldiers standing in the same place for the same reason. The morning light grew stronger as the hours passed. Vehicles carrying Ukrainian defenders moved slowly between villages. Residents stepped outside their homes to watch the roads. Quiet conversations continued near fences and small gates. Everyone understood that the situation could change quickly. Russian forces were attempting to move across southern Ukraine. Mykolaiv stood directly in that path, and the villages surrounding the city had become the first line of protection. The cooperation between civilians and soldiers created a sense of readiness that spread across the area. People knew their surroundings. They knew which roads connected to neighboring villages. They knew how the fields opened toward the horizon. That familiarity became an advantage. The soldiers did not need to guess where the land narrowed or where vehicles might slow down. The villagers could point directly to those places. Together they prepared, together they waited. One older resident, standing near a wooden fence that faced the road leading toward Mykolaiv, said something that stayed with the soldiers nearby. "This is where our lives are." Again, the words were simple, but simplicity can carry weight, because when people speak about the place where their lives exist, their homes, their memories, their families, the meaning becomes unmistakably clear. Outside Mykolaiv, that meaning was visible in every small action. Villagers and soldiers moving side by side, watching the same roads, standing on the same ground, preparing to protect the same homes. And as the day continued, the quiet villages surrounding Mykolaiv began to transform into something else entirely. A defensive line built not only by soldiers, but by an entire community. As the day continued outside Mykolaiv, the villages that had once followed a familiar rhythm began adjusting to a completely different reality. The narrow roads connecting those communities now carried a new kind of importance. Every vehicle moving through the area was watched carefully. Every unfamiliar sound across the fields caused people to pause and listen. The Ukrainian soldiers stationed there had already taken their assigned positions. Equipment had been arranged along defensive points, and patrols moved between the villages with steady caution. But the presence of the villagers remained just as visible. They were not standing behind closed doors waiting for events to unfold somewhere else. They were present in the same spaces where the soldiers worked. Some walked the edges of the roads, quietly observing the open land beyond the village boundaries. Others spoke with the defenders, sharing details about routes that passed through the surrounding farmland. The land around Mykolaiv is wide and open in many places. Fields stretch for long distances before reaching small clusters of homes or tree lines. That openness allows movement across the region, but it also allows visibility. The villagers understood those patterns better than anyone. They had spent years moving through the same fields during planting seasons, harvesting crops, or simply traveling between neighboring communities. Now that familiarity became part of the defensive preparation. A Ukrainian soldier stood beside a map placed on the hood of a vehicle parked near the edge of one village. Around him, several residents pointed toward specific roads and paths that ran across the land. They spoke calmly, describing where vehicles usually slowed or where the road narrowed. The soldier listened carefully because in moments like that, local knowledge can become just as valuable as any equipment. The cooperation between soldiers and villagers continued throughout the afternoon. People carried supplies between houses and defensive points. Others helped guide vehicles moving along unfamiliar routes. There was no confusion about why these actions were happening. Everyone understood that Russian forces were attempting to advance through southern Ukraine. Mykolaiv remained one of the cities standing in the way of that movement, and the villages surrounding the city had become a protective ring, a ring formed not only by military planning, but by the people who lived there. The atmosphere across the villages held a quiet determination. No loud announcements, no dramatic gatherings, just steady work. Residents stepped outside their homes and looked down the same roads they had traveled for years, but now those roads represented the direction from which danger could arrive. A middle-aged resident stood near the entrance to a small dirt road that connected two villages. He watched the distance for a moment before speaking softly to one of the soldiers standing nearby. "We know every turn out here." The sentence carried a sense of confidence, not defiance. Confidence in familiarity. Confidence in the land that had shaped their daily lives. For the Ukrainian defenders, that knowledge created something important: trust. The soldiers knew that the people around them understood the region in ways no map could fully capture, where the ground softened after rain, where a vehicle might struggle to move through a narrow path, where visibility stretched far across the fields. Every detail mattered. The work continued through the afternoon hours. Some residents helped move materials that could slow traffic along the roads leading toward the villages. Others assisted in reinforcing observation points. From a distance, these actions might have looked like ordinary village activity, but the purpose behind each movement was clear. Preparing the area to protect Mykolaiv, a Ukrainian soldier paused briefly near the edge of a field where several villagers had gathered. He looked across the open land and spoke quietly, almost as if reflecting on the moment. When people stand together like this, it changes everything. The words did not carry excitement, they carried recognition. Recognition of the unusual partnership forming between professional defenders and civilians who refused to abandon their homes. As the sun began lowering toward the horizon, the villages outside Mykolaiv grew quieter. The work of preparation had slowed. Observation points remained active. Defenders stayed positioned along the roads. Residents returned briefly to their houses, though many remained outside, watching the distance across the fields. The environment felt tense but controlled. Everyone knew that the situation could shift quickly, but they also knew something else. They were not facing that uncertainty alone. Soldiers and villagers shared the same ground, the same roads, the same responsibility. The villages had become places where defense and daily life existed side by side. A small group of residents stood near a wooden gate overlooking one of the roads leading toward the city. The evening light stretched across the land, casting long shadows through the fields. One of the older villagers spoke quietly, his voice carrying the calm tone of someone who had spent many years on that land. "This place has always been ours." The sentence did not need further explanation, because everyone present understood what it meant. It meant homes built over generations. It meant land that families had cared for year after year. It meant memories tied to every street and every field surrounding the village. Protecting those places was not an abstract idea. It was personal. As darkness slowly approached the region, the Ukrainian soldiers remained in position along the roads outside Mykolaiv, and the villagers who had helped prepare those defenses remained nearby, watching, listening, standing close to the homes they had chosen to protect. The land itself seemed to hold the quiet determination shared by the people gathered there, fields stretching across the horizon, roads leading toward the city, villages where ordinary life had been interrupted but not abandoned. Together, the defenders and the residents continued holding their ground. And as night approached, the villages outside Mykolaiv stood as a place where a community and a military force had joined in the same purpose: protecting the homes that stood behind them. Night settled slowly over the villages outside Mykolaiv. The light that had filled the fields throughout the day faded into a darker sky, and the open land that stretched across southern Ukraine became quieter. The roads connecting the villages remained visible only in fragments under scattered lights from homes and vehicles. But even as darkness arrived, the sense of watchfulness did not disappear. Ukrainian soldiers remained positioned along the roads and observation points they had prepared earlier in the day. Equipment stayed in place. Communication between defensive positions continued quietly, and nearby, many of the villagers who had helped prepare those positions remained close to their homes. The atmosphere carried a kind of stillness that often appears in moments when people are waiting, not waiting passively, waiting with awareness. Outside Mykolaiv, that awareness extended across the entire community. Small houses stood along narrow streets that had once held the sounds of ordinary village life. Doors opened occasionally as residents stepped outside to look toward the fields or down the road that led toward the city. Some stood beside gates or fences. Others remained near the edges of their yards. No large gatherings formed, but the presence of people throughout the villages created a quiet network of observation. The Ukrainian defenders noticed that presence. Soldiers moved between positions with careful attention, and when they passed near the homes of residents, brief exchanges often followed. A nod, a short greeting, sometimes a few words. The conversations were rarely long, but the meaning behind them was clear. Everyone in that place understood the reason they were there. Mykolaiv remained behind them, a city that had become an important point in the defense of southern Ukraine. The villages surrounding the city formed a protective space between the advancing direction of Russian forces and the homes inside the city. Those villages had never been designed to serve as defensive lines. They had been built for ordinary life: gardens, farms, small shops, children playing along the streets. Yet the events unfolding across Ukraine had changed the purpose of those places. The fields surrounding the villages now held observation points. The roads that once carried tractors and delivery trucks now carried Ukrainian military vehicles, moving carefully between positions, and the people who lived in those villages had become part of the effort to protect their own communities. Late in the evening, a Ukrainian soldier paused near a position overlooking one of the roads that connected several villages to Mykolaiv. From that point, the open land stretched outward into the darkness. The soldier stood quietly for a moment before speaking in a calm voice. "This is their home." The sentence was simple, but it captured something important about the situation unfolding outside the city. The people standing nearby were not simply witnesses to a military operation. They were residents protecting the place where their lives had unfolded. The soldiers understood that connection, and the villagers understood the role the defenders were playing. The partnership between the two groups had grown naturally during the hours leading up to nightfall. There had been no formal announcement, no written agreement, just shared work, shared awareness, and a shared determination to keep the villages safe. The night air across the fields carried the faint sounds of vehicles moving between defensive points. From time to time, a light appeared briefly on a distant road before disappearing again behind trees or houses. Inside the villages, many homes remained dimly lit. Families gathered quietly indoors. Some residents stepped outside again, looking toward the horizon before returning inside. Life continued, even under the shadow of the conflict surrounding the region. But the sense of protection remained visible. The Ukrainian soldiers did not leave their positions. They remained stationed along the roads and fields where they had prepared their defensive lines. The villagers did not withdraw completely into their homes either. Many remained close to the edges of their property, listening and watching the same land they had known their entire lives. One older resident, standing near the entrance of a small farm road, spoke quietly as he looked across the fields. "We grew up here." The words carried a quiet weight, because growing up somewhere means knowing the land in ways that maps and satellite images cannot show. It means remembering how the fields look during different seasons. It means recognizing every bend in the road and every row of trees along the horizon. For the villagers outside Mykolaiv, those memories now existed alongside the responsibility of protecting the place they knew so well. The Ukrainian soldiers respected that connection. They saw it in the way residents moved through the villages during the day. They heard it in the calm voices of people explaining which roads connected to neighboring communities. They felt it in the quiet determination shared by everyone standing in that region. As the night continued, the villages outside Mykolaiv remained calm but alert. The roads stayed under watch. Observation points remained active. Communication between defensive positions continued steadily, and the homes scattered across the villages stood behind those defensive lines. Inside those homes lived the families who had chosen to remain near the land they loved. Outside those homes stood the soldiers and residents who had worked side by side to protect them. One Ukrainian defender, looking across the dark fields, spoke a final sentence that reflected the spirit of that moment. "We are standing where we belong." No grand speeches followed those words, no dramatic gestures, just the quiet continuation of what had already been happening throughout the day. Villagers and soldiers sharing the same ground, watching the same roads, protecting the same homes. And outside Mykolaiv, those villages remained exactly what they had always been, places where people lived their lives. Places where families built their memories, places worth protecting.